Welcome to step 4 of creating your sermon. So far, we've been talking about how to develop your thought. In this last session, we're going to talk about the importance of delivering your thought, how to do it as passionately and with as much conviction as possible. What I want to do is spend some time talking to you about the way you use your voice, verbal communication, but I also want to give some real attention to nonverbal communication. In fact, some communications experts argue that the way we say something is actually as important, perhaps even more important, than what we say. A scary thought, I know. That's why we're going to give some attention to it. First, let me talk to you a little bit about the way you use your voice, verbal communication. It's important that you learn the value of raising your pitch and lowering it throughout your sermon delivery. You can raise your pitch when you're going to give emphasis to something, and you can lower your pitch when you're going to a secondary phrase or closing out a thought. I've often found it helpful to lower my pitch when I'm going to make a transition. So it's important to think about it like a roller coaster. There are ups and there are downs. I'll tell people who have been to Disney World and have ridden the monorail, a ride that has one height and one speed the entire way, that many sermons I've heard were preached just that way, like monorail sermons, same speed, same rate, same pitch all throughout. Instead, we want our sermons to be like roller coasters, with ups and with downs, a strong beginning and a strong ending. Interestingly, the way you use pitch can actually change the meaning of a sentence. It can have the same word order, same punctuation, but depending upon where you raise or lower your pitch, it can mean something different. So for instance, if I were to take the question, do you believe him? If I were saying it like he was a crazy guy, the life of the party, I might be like, do you believe him? On the other hand, if someone had told me something that sounded a little too good to be true and I wanted to get someone else's advice, I might say, do you believe him? So you notice that even though it's the same word order, same word, same punctuation, pitch can change the meaning. Be sure you vary your pitch meaningfully in the delivery of your sermon. Secondly is pace. This has to do with the rate of your speech. It's very important that you not speak so quickly that people can't understand what you're saying. And something I found helpful is that if I'll pronounce carefully, it's almost impossible to speak too quickly. Now, you can speed up when you're about to transition. You also can slow down when you really want something emphasized. But like pitch, be sure that you vary pace meaningfully and intentionally. Pause. Pause is a thoughtful silence, and you can do it to draw attention to an idea or to draw attention to an idea that you just uttered. Pause can be very, very effective, especially if you struggle with verbal filler. Let me say something about verbal filler. There are people who mistakenly think they have to be saying something all the time in order for people to remain engaged. But the fact of the matter is, there is such a thing as a speech-thought differential. That is a processing time between the speaker saying something, the listener hearing it, and being able to process and understand what the speaker intended. So using pause can really help to draw attention to what it is that you feel is important or draw attention to something that you've just said is important. It's also a very effective way of dealing with verbal filler. Pronounce. Learn how to pronounce correctly all of the names of the people and places in the Bible. This is also very important when doing funerals and weddings. With the internet, it ought to be a very easy thing to look up how to pronounce a word. If you find that you have trouble with it, write it out phonetically in your notes, and you can look down and read that while you're saying it. Now, having said all of this, I'm going to offer you a piece of advice that's going to sound a little contradictory. It is better that you would mispronounce boldly than mumble correctly. But what's ideal is that you pronounce correctly. The last thing I want to say about verbal communication is punch. That has to do with the use of volume. And you can raise your volume when you're wanting to make a point. Having said that, you can also lower your volume when you want to make a point. Either way is effective. But what you don't want to do is punch everything. Because if you punch everything, you're emphasizing everything. And if you emphasize everything, well, really, nothing's getting emphasized. How do you find out whether your verbal communication is as effective as it could be? Painful but true, you watch yourself. You record yourself and you watch it. Now you can also use a creative team, other members of the staff, a spouse, or some trusted leaders to give you feedback. But I promise you, there is nothing as educational as recording yourself and watching it to find out where your strengths and your weaknesses are as a communicator. I said at the beginning that nonverbal communication is considered by some to be as important or perhaps even more important than verbal communication. And now I want to give you some specific areas in nonverbals to be conscientious about. First, eye contact. Eye contact is the best way we have of knowing whether people are paying attention to us or not. Some people are natural with their eye contact. In fact, if anyone's ever told you you're a naturally gifted speaker, chances are part of what they're complimenting you about is your ability to make eye contact without much difficulty. However, not everyone is wired that way, and learning to make good eye contact can be an effort for some. If you're one of those who find it difficult when in front of people to make eye contact, something you might want to consider. Learn when you stand up to speak, before you begin to speak, to scan the audience for the friendly listeners. They'll be smiling and nodding, and they're glad it's you up there and not them. Mark where they are. And then when you're preaching your sermon, scan everybody in the sanctuary, scan everybody in the audience, but land on those who have revealed themselves as friendly listeners. Now, eventually, I trust you'll get confident enough that you'll be able to make eye contact with large numbers of people. Nevertheless, it's important, whether you are someone who does it naturally or someone who needs to grow in this area, to use eye contact to know whether people are paying attention to you or not. A second area in nonverbal communication is facial expressions. You want to be sure that your facial expressions correspond to your content. In fact, if you're angry, but you're reading a passage about God's love, that's sending a mixed message. Further, if you're reading something about God's judgment and you have a smile on your face, people are going to have a hard time believing that you believe what it is that you're reading. Instead, if a passage or sermon is dealing with joy or fear, anger, concern, hope, let that be reflected in your facial expressions. Also, for those who struggle with being monotone, facial expressions can also help your pitch and pace. If you're someone who struggles with having monotone pitch and pace, by varying your facial expressions, your voice will naturally follow. Another important nonverbal characteristic is gestures, the way you use your hands and the way you use body movement. Gestures should be intentional. They can even be a little bit rehearsed if it helps you to get a point across, but you don't want to make the mistake of thinking that every single thing you are going to say requires a gesture to reinforce it. Instead, what you want to do is use gestures to better communicate the idea. And there's several ways you can do this. You can use a gesture to anticipate an idea. You might say, in 2018, we're going to the next level. The last nonverbal characteristic I want to talk about is dress, what it is that you're wearing. Now, as a rule, preachers of the gospel should be dressed modestly, but that is going to differ from place to place. As a rule of thumb, I usually encourage my students, don't wear anything that draws attention to your body or your bank account. Be sure that you have full range of movement. If you had to choose between being a little overdressed or underdressed, it's always going to be better to be overdressed. And again, some of that is going to be determined by your culture. I preach in churches where I have to show up wearing a three-piece suit. I've preached in other places where they said I could wear shorts if I wanted to. So a lot of those decisions are going to be based both on who your audience is, but also on what you have and what you can wear that's not a distraction. When it comes to fashion, don't be the first person to wear it, and don't be the last person to wear it. Don't wear something and people think that it's 60s day, and on the other hand, don't wear something and people think that it's sci-fi day. One of the things I've found that helped me to discern whether what I plan to wear to preach is appropriate or not is to do a mirror test. Can I get up in front of a full-length mirror and move around with the full range of motion that I'll actually use in my sermon, and do so in a way that is comfortable and doesn't draw unnecessary attention to what I'm wearing? Now, I mentioned earlier the importance of recording yourself in order to get a sense of how you use your voice. But let me specify what I have in mind. If you really want to improve as a communicator, it's not enough to just listen to audio recordings of yourself. If you want to improve your nonverbals, you need to watch video recordings of yourself. Get a sense of what you look like. Do you have good eye contact? Do your facial expressions reinforce your content? How about your gestures? Are your clothes appropriate? This is one of the most reliable ways of figuring out what you actually look and sound like, and it'll also help you begin to develop a plan for self-improvement. One other sermonary feature I want to mention while talking about preaching your sermon with passion and conviction is what's called the podium mode. Now, the podium mode allows all of the work that you have been doing in sermonary to be presented to you as an outline. You can then either print it off as a PDF or upload it to your tablet. The point is, you will have a ready-made sermon outline that'll be easy for you to follow and consult as you're preaching. I'm sometimes asked about notes in the pulpit. My own view is that you should have well-prepared notes that you practice with, but just a rough outline so that you won't find yourself reading and thus killing a lively sense of communication while you're preaching. Another helpful feature in podium mode is that it has a timer. So if you've decided to read your notes from a tablet, while it's in podium mode, it will not only show you what time it is, but how long you've taken. And you might find that that'll be a much easier and subtler way of keeping track of the clock rather than looking at the one in the back of the sanctuary or your watch on your wrist. Let me offer one last thought about all of these steps that we've been learning. Finding your big idea, outlining your message, creating your introduction and conclusion, and delivering your sermon with passion and conviction. These steps, when first learned, can seem overwhelming. So I want to encourage you, learn to eat the elephant a bite at a time. When you wake up on Monday morning, but you know Sunday's coming, instead of planning to try to do all of this on Saturday night, work through these steps a piece at a time. Give an hour or two every day to each of these steps. Thank you for joining us in these sessions on how to create a sermon. I hope you've been helped by them, and I want to remind you to go to Sermonary's online resources and tutorials to be able to better explore the features that'll help you to develop sermons that are biblical, relevant, and worth showing up to listen to week after week.